They arrived as the perfect couple. They left as the subject of the most horrifying scandal Raven's Cove had ever seen. To outsiders, it looked like the beginning of something beautiful. Two newlyweds walking hand in hand along the shoreline, their laughter carried on the wind, their eyes locked with the weight of new vows and a future full of promise. The sea stretched wide beside them, calm and inviting. Locals smiled at their affection, unaware of the quiet storm inching closer with each passing day. Raven's Cove had seen its share of love stories, but this one stood out, not for how it started, but for how it ended. Behind a veil of luxury and affection was a truth neither of them could escape. One was keeping a secret. The other had spent his life fearing betrayal. By the time the truth surfaced, it was far too late. What followed wasn't just a tragedy. It was a brutal, irreversible breaking point. They were supposed to be celebrating the start of forever. Their suite overlooked the ocean, and every evening ended with candlelit dinners, warm embraces, and the soft murmur of the waves below. Guests at the resort would later say the couple seemed inseparable, devoted, even. But they didn't see the tension behind the smiles. They didn't hear the late-night arguments muffled behind closed doors. They didn't notice her glancing at her phone a little too often, or the way his eyes lingered just a beat too long when she looked away. Something had shifted. And when it finally broke, it did so violently. Now, a town known for peace and leisure carries the memory of a night soaked in blood and betrayal. What if the person you trusted most had a secret that could get you killed? Have you ever ignored a red flag, hoping love would be enough? This is the story of how a fairy tale marriage unraveled in blood. Stick with us until the end to find out what really drove a husband to kill his bride on their honeymoon. This wasn't a crime born in darkness or desperation. It happened under the glare of a tropical sun, in a room meant for love, not violence. One moment they were honeymooners sipping wine on a private balcony. The next, their names were etched into the region's darkest headlines. He wasn't a violent man. She wasn't a reckless woman. But choices, some made in secret, some made in silence, collided in a way that no one could undo. By morning, the suite was sealed off with crime tape. The staff, shaken and silent, whispered questions they were too afraid to say aloud. What went so wrong between two people who seemed so right? And how could anyone miss the signs? This isn't just the story of a marriage destroyed by betrayal. It's about how one hidden truth, left to rot, can push someone to the edge. And once that edge is crossed, there's no coming back. Marina Voss wasn't born into wealth, but you'd never know it by the way she moved through a room. Raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of a small inland city, she learned early how to adapt, impress, and blend in with those who had more than she did. Charm was her currency, and she spent it wisely. From waitressing in her teens to landing a job at an elite interior design firm in her 20s, Marina had a gift for knowing what people wanted to hear, and when to say it. She dressed with intention, spoke with warmth, and carried herself like someone used to getting what she wanted. And often she did. Friends described her as magnetic, someone whose presence shifted the mood. She had a way of turning small talk into deeper conversations, and her laughter often drew attention in crowded rooms. She didn't flaunt her past, but she never pretended to be someone she wasn't. Or so they thought. By the time she met Dorian Crane, Marina had mastered the art of making people believe she was exactly where she belonged. What no one realized, perhaps not even Dorian, was how carefully she had constructed the life she now lived. How much of it was real, and how much was maintained out of fear that it could all be taken away, remained a quiet question no one dared to ask. Dorian Crane lived most of his life in quiet rooms, libraries, lecture halls, and long walks through books more than people. A university professor with a background in classical history, he was drawn to structure, order, and the lessons buried in human behavior. He spoke carefully, choosing words like he chose his clothes, with precision and restraint. Raised by a single mother who had endured her own share of betrayal, Dorian grew up valuing loyalty above all else. He wasn't naive, but he believed in honor. To him, trust wasn't given freely, it was earned, kept, and never broken. Though not flashy or loud, he held a quiet authority. His students admired his calm presence, and his colleagues respected his dedication. He wasn't the kind of man who made grand romantic gestures, but he was steady, consistent. The kind of partner many believed could offer a safe life to someone seeking more than surface charm. When he met Marina at a gallery event organized by mutual friends, it didn't take long for him to feel drawn to her warmth. She brought lightness to his seriousness, laughter to his routines. For a man who spent years studying ancient empires and long-forgotten betrayals, he let his guard down far more quickly than anyone expected. Perhaps even more than he realized. To Dorian, love was sacred, something worth protecting. He didn't demand perfection, but he expected truth. And while he tried not to dwell on the possibility of deception, it lingered quietly beneath the surface of his thoughts. His life had been built around structure, and when that structure was threatened, there was no blueprint to follow. Their romance moved quickly, too quickly, some whispered. Within weeks of meeting, Marina was spending weekends at Dorian's townhouse, trading her city nightlife for quiet evenings filled with wine, conversation, and classical records. For Dorian, it felt like a fresh start. For Marina, it was a new chapter that offered comfort, admiration, and a future more stable than anything she'd known. When he proposed just 9 months later, there were no hesitations. The engagement was met with congratulations and raised eyebrows in equal measure. Still, the couple pressed forward, determined to prove the skeptics wrong. Their wedding was lavish. Held at a historical estate just outside Raven's Cove, it brought together socialites, scholars, and distant relatives under a sky of white florals and gold chandeliers. Guests were stunned by the elegance, but some noticed more than the decor. A few mentioned Marina's brief absences during the reception. Others noticed how often she checked her phone, or how her smile seemed forced in certain photos. To the outside world, these were forgettable moments, nothing worth dwelling on. But to those who looked a little longer, there were cracks, subtle ones. Dorian, ever the gentleman, missed them. Or perhaps he chose not to see. Love had made him generous in his assumptions. Marina's charm had a way of softening his skepticism. After all, wasn't it normal for any couple to carry a bit of mystery? They left for their honeymoon the next morning, both believing they were stepping into the future. But one of them brought the past with them. Raven's Cove was the kind of place people came to forget the world. Tucked along a quiet coastline, it was known for its gentle surf, open skies, and the kind of stillness that made it feel untouched. The community was small but proud, locals who valued tradition, privacy, and discretion. The resort where Dorian and Marina stayed was a favorite among couples who could afford seclusion with a touch of opulence. Every suite had an ocean view, private access to the beach, and personal attendants trained to keep their distance unless summoned. Days passed slowly there, measured by sunrises, long meals, and the rhythm of the tide. It was the perfect choice for a honeymoon, remote, refined, and romantic. The kind of place where problems were meant to dissolve with the sound of waves and the scent of sea air. But not every guest arrived to let go of the past. Marina seemed more relaxed than she had in weeks. Dorian, for the first time in months, appeared fully at ease. The resort gave them space to breathe, but it also gave silence room to stretch. And in that silence, certain truths began to surface, quietly but without mercy. The first 2 days at the resort felt like something out of a dream. Their villa stood high above the shoreline, perched just far enough from the others to offer complete privacy. Large glass doors opened to an endless view of the ocean, and each morning began with breakfast on the terrace, where the only sound was the sea brushing against the rocks below. Marina looked radiant in the daylight, her hair loose, her face relaxed. She laughed easily, touched Dorian's hand often, and leaned into the role of a new bride. To anyone watching from afar, they seemed at ease, lost in the comfort of one another. But Dorian noticed something else. Moments when she slipped away without explanation. Excuses that didn't quite match up. A call that came in just before dinner, which she declined too quickly. A second phone, tucked into the lining of her luggage, never spoken of. She thought she was being discreet. She wasn't. Late one evening, while Marina lingered in the outdoor tub, Dorian returned from a walk and saw her handbag on the table, left slightly open. Her phone screen lit up with a message, short, cryptic, but undeniably personal. His breath caught. He picked up the phone. The name on the screen read, Gideon. The exchange was short, written in a kind of coded affection that didn't need full words to be understood. Terms like "still thinking about last time" and "it should have been us" weren't just innocent texts between friends. Dorian set the phone down without a sound. But his silence didn't mean he wasn't screaming on the inside. He stepped out to the balcony, staring into the horizon as if it could explain what he'd just seen. His heart was steady. His thoughts were not. That night, Marina fell asleep beside him as if nothing had changed. She spoke softly about their plans for the next day, a couple's massage, a boat ride, maybe a private dinner near the cliffs. Dorian nodded, pretending to listen. But he wasn't there. His body lay beside hers, but his thoughts were locked on every word, every message, every lie she told without blinking. He stared at the ceiling long after her breathing slowed. Each second pulled him further from the man he'd been just hours earlier. He thought about the vows they'd exchanged. The guest who'd toasted to their forever. The smiles, the photos, the speech he had written by hand. And now this. It wasn't just the cheating. It was the ease with which she had compartmentalized it. The way she kissed him that morning with the same mouth that had whispered to someone else. The man who once found peace in logic now felt like he was standing inside a room with no doors. By sunrise, his demeanor had changed. Quiet, yes, but not calm. Measured, but not composed. He watched her closely over breakfast. Every gesture, every word, he studied it all. Was she capable of guilt? Did she suspect he knew? Her voice was light, almost rehearsed, as if reading from a script she'd used before. Dorian responded politely, never breaking rhythm, never tipping his hand. She didn't notice the difference. Or maybe she thought she still had control. But something had shifted. Permanently. He no longer saw the woman across from him as his wife. He saw her as a stranger who had climbed into his life and stolen something sacred. And for the first time in years, Dorian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not sorrow. Not confusion. Resentment. Before she married Dorian, Marina had promised herself she was done with Gideon's slate. Their history was complicated, built on stolen hours and unresolved desire. He was magnetic in ways Dorian wasn't. Wild, persuasive, emotionally unpredictable. He challenged her, made her feel alive in a way that didn't ask for responsibility. But he never offered stability. That was Dorian's role. Still, Marina hadn't deleted Gideon's number. She hadn't thrown away the letters he wrote in slanted, hurried handwriting, or the photos he sent late at night. For a while, she ignored the urge to reply. She buried the guilt and leaned into Dorian's affection. He gave her consistency, tenderness, and a future she could count on. But Gideon never stayed silent for long. On the eve of her wedding, he sent a message, "You'll never stop thinking about me." She didn't respond, but she read it twice. During the honeymoon, while Dorian was out reading by the sea or walking the cliffs alone, she'd open the second phone she had tucked deep in her bag. Just for a few minutes. Just to check if he'd written again. He had. Their messages were short, coded, and increasingly reckless. They referenced moments only the two of them would understand. Days spent in hotel rooms across the city, the time they were nearly caught, the promises whispered that neither of them ever truly intended to keep. It wasn't love anymore. Maybe it never was. But it was something Marina couldn't quite release. Gideon made her feel seen in a different way, less stable, more electric. The kind of thrill she told herself she didn't need anymore, yet kept chasing in private. She told herself Dorian didn't need to know, that no harm would come from messages never meant to surface. She believed her secret would stay contained. She was wrong. Dorian had been betrayed before, but never like this. When he was 13, he came home from school to find his mother sitting in silence, her wedding ring on the table, the house too quiet. His father had walked out that morning without a word. No note. No goodbye. Just an empty drawer and a door left half open. It took years for Dorian to understand how deeply that kind of departure shapes a person. How it teaches you to value honesty like breath and recoil at the thought of deception. He'd spent most of his life avoiding people who reminded him of that pain. He chose slow, thoughtful connections. He kept boundaries, not walls, but ones that gave him time to read people fully. Or so he thought. When he met Marina, something softened. She didn't just walk into his life, she filled it. Bright, unpredictable, full of color. He told himself she was different. Someone he could finally trust with everything. Now he felt like he'd failed at the one thing he thought he understood. The betrayal was sharper not just because it came from her, but because it proved something ugly he had long tried to suppress. That no matter how careful you are, people can still lie with a smile. In the hours following his discovery, Dorian moved through the resort like a man going through rehearsed motions. Meals were eaten quietly. Conversation stayed light. But inside, everything was shifting. He read the messages again. Not because he didn't believe them the first time, but because he couldn't stop looking at the words that destroyed everything. It should have been us. Those 5 words unraveled his peace. They weren't just flirtation. They were intent. They were a door she'd never closed. By the 3rd day of their stay, Dorian wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was preparing for the truth. On the 4th morning, Marina wore white. A soft linen dress that moved with the breeze and caught the light in a way that made her seem almost ethereal. She poured coffee, added sugar to Dorian's cup like always, and asked about whether he wanted to take a boat ride after lunch. Dorian waited until the waiter left before he spoke. "Who's Gideon?" Her hand paused mid-stir. The spoon tapped once against the ceramic, then stilled. "I saw the messages," he added. She didn't deny it. Not immediately. Her gaze drifted down toward her plate. I didn't mean for you to see that. That's not an answer. Her throat moved as she swallowed, but no words came. For a moment, there was just the sound of distant waves and the clink of cutlery from nearby tables. Dorian kept his voice steady. How long has it been going on? Marina finally looked at him. Her face wasn't defiant, it was tired. Before we got married, she said. But it was over. I ended it. Clearly you didn't, he replied. I didn't plan for it to continue, she said, her voice lowering. It's not what you think. You're sending private messages to another man on our honeymoon, he said. What exactly am I supposed to think? Marina fumbled for words, trying to thread together an explanation, but none of them landed with weight. She spoke of confusion, loneliness, unfinished emotions. She insisted she loved Dorian, that this wasn't about wanting to leave him, it was about unresolved feelings that didn't mean anything anymore. But to Dorian, every word only confirmed what he already knew. She had made space for someone else. She had done it willingly, repeatedly. You should have told me, he said, before we stood in front of everyone and made promises. I didn't want to lose you, she whispered. You already did, he replied, his tone flat. For the first time in days, Marina realized she'd underestimated him. The waiter returned with fresh fruit and pastries. Marina wiped her eyes quickly, put on a forced smile, and thanked him. Dorian didn't look up. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, white at the knuckles. As soon as they were alone again, his restraint began to slip. You told me I was the only one. That's all I ever needed to believe. I was trying to move on from him, she said. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But Gideon kept reaching out. And you kept answering. I didn't want to, but you did. Her defenses collapsed under the weight of his tone. She stopped speaking and simply stared across the table, her mouth slightly open, as if hoping the silence would soften the moment. You don't get to do this, Dorian continued. You don't get to say vows and then decide they don't apply when someone from your past sends a few messages. It wasn't just about him, she snapped. You were so distant those last few months. Everything became cold. I didn't know how to reach you. Dorian let out a bitter laugh. So your solution was to reconnect with someone who treated you like a secret? That's not fair. No, he said. It's not. A passing staff member glanced in their direction. Marina looked away quickly, her cheeks flushed with heat. Dorian leaned forward, lowering his voice. I want to know everything. I want to know how long you've been lying. How many times? Where? When? I don't remember, she said quietly. I didn't count. That answer hit harder than anything else. Neither of them noticed the small device mounted discreetly in the corner of the terrace wall, part of the resort's promotional project capturing guest experiences for a behind-the-scenes honeymoon series. A light blinked red. Recording. Their voices, rising and falling, every word weighted with history and blame, were now part of something bigger than either of them could control. The confrontation had started with questions. It would end with something else entirely. After the incident, investigators began reviewing everything. Phone records, written correspondence, and electronic messages recovered from both Marina's personal phone and the secondary device found zipped inside her travel case. One email stood out. It was brief. The subject line was blank. The body of the message was a string of dates and a hotel name in Lisbon. Attached was a scanned copy of a one-way plane ticket under the name Marissa Vale, an alias that hadn't come up in any of Marina's official records. Payment had been made in cash. The booking had been made just 3 days before the honeymoon. Another file uncovered in her email was a digital folder of scanned documents. Personal notes, conversations with Gideon, even a drafted letter to Dorian that had never been sent. In it she wrote, I know this is wrong, but I can't be in two lives at once. I thought I could love you both differently, but I was wrong. That single line reframed everything. What Dorian had seen as a careless flirtation now took the shape of something far more planned. Marina hadn't just slipped into a moment of weakness, she had quietly built a way out. Whether she truly intended to go through with it remained unknown, but the groundwork was there. Authorities traced Gideon's location. He had left the country shortly before the wedding and returned around the same time Dorian and Marina checked into the resort. No digital link connected him to the incident itself, but the implication was impossible to ignore. Marina had been preparing for a future that didn't include Dorian. A second life. A second ending. What remained unclear was whether Dorian had any sense of that full picture, or whether the confrontation was fueled by the discovery alone. The escape plan added weight to the growing theory among locals. Maybe this wasn't a sudden reaction. Maybe it had been building longer than anyone thought. After the crime made headlines, staff at the resort were quietly interviewed. Some remembered the couple fondly, describing them as polite, reserved, and affectionate in public. But a few recalled moments that felt, in hindsight, unusual. One housekeeper noted that on the third day of their stay, she had entered the suite to deliver fresh towels and found Dorian sitting alone in the dark. Marina wasn't there. He hadn't responded to her greeting, just stared out the glass doors toward the ocean. He didn't move. He didn't speak. She backed out quietly and mentioned the incident to a colleague, unsure what to make of it at the time. Another employee, a server who worked their breakfast shift, remembered a strange interaction. Dorian had asked for his coffee to be served precisely at 7:30 a.m., and when it arrived a few minutes late, he barely acknowledged the staff. He wasn't angry, the server said later. He just looked different, like he was somewhere else entirely. Several guests also commented on how the couple seemed increasingly distant from each other as the days went by. On the first night, they were spotted holding hands, kissing by the fire pit. By the third night, they sat apart during dinner. Their conversations appeared one-sided. Marina would speak and Dorian would listen, expressionless. Rumors started to spread among resort employees. Some believed the couple had argued. Others thought Dorian might have learned something that rattled him. One concierge overheard Marina requesting access to the business center late at night, where she used a public computer to access her personal email. When asked if anyone suspected violence, the consensus was unanimous. No one expected anything like what happened. Still, as one staff member put it, he wasn't the same man who checked in. Those who observed him closely sensed something building, not rage exactly but a kind of internal retreat. A mental distance that made him unreadable. And once that silence broke, everything changed. By the evening of the fifth day, the mood between them had soured beyond repair. Marina tried to make peace, small talk over dinner, a shared glass of wine, but Dorian wasn't speaking much anymore. He moved quietly through the suite, answering only when addressed, his voice flat and distant. When she tried to touch him, he pulled away. That night, Marina stood on the balcony, looking out into the fading horizon, the sky streaked with the last hints of daylight. Dorian watched her from the couch. She looked calm, even at peace. He couldn't understand it. After everything that had come to light, after what she'd admitted, how could she still be so composed? He stood. His steps toward her were slow. She turned as he approached, expecting maybe a gesture of reconciliation. Instead, he asked her a single question. Were you going to leave with him? The air shifted. Marina's mouth opened slightly, caught off guard. She didn't answer at first. I don't know, she said finally. I didn't decide. That was the wrong answer. He stepped closer. You bought a ticket. She stiffened. You went through my things? You were planning to disappear, he said. You were going to walk away from our marriage like it was a phase. I wasn't going to leave, she said. I was scared, Dorian. I didn't know what I was doing. You knew enough to make a plan. You just didn't have the nerve to follow through. Marina raised her voice. Don't twist this. You were distant for months. I felt alone in this marriage long before Gideon came back. Dorian's face changed. It wasn't rage. It was something colder. Something cracked. I gave you everything, he said. I let you into every part of my life. I built my future around you. And I never asked you to, she snapped. The silence that followed that sentence was louder than any scream. Marina turned away, but Dorian stepped in front of her. I didn't ask you to, he repeated, his voice low. You said yes. You stood there, in front of everyone we love, and you said yes. Marina backed up a step. You're scaring me. Good, he said. Because now you finally understand what it feels like to lose control over something that mattered. She reached for her phone. Dorian knocked it from her hand. It hit the floor and skidded across the tiles. What are you doing? She cried out. I want the truth, he said. All of it. No more lies. No more pretending you didn't mean what you wrote. I told you I was sorry. Sorry doesn't fix betrayal. His voice cracked on that final word. Years of held-in emotion spilled out in seconds. Old wounds, fresh ones, and fears he thought he'd buried long ago. His hands slammed against the wall beside her. Not a strike. A warning. A loss of direction. Marina screamed and tried to push past him, but he grabbed her wrist. The struggle was short. Unplanned. Brutal. Furniture was knocked over. A lamp crashed to the ground. She kicked and fought, clawing at his arms, but he was beyond reason. Beyond restraint. Her screams turned to gasps. His voice became something unrecognizable. The resort's recording equipment, set to document newlywed moments for a feel-good promotional series, was still running. It captured everything: the thud of limbs against walls, glass breaking, muffled shouts, and a final, blood-chilling silence. When the noise stopped, the suite looked nothing like it had just minutes before. Tables overturned, fabric torn, wine spilled across white floors now stained with more than just alcohol. Dorian stood in the center of the chaos, chest heaving, his hands trembling. Marina lay on the floor, unmoving. He took a step back as if trying to separate himself from what had just happened. His expression wasn't rage anymore, it was disbelief. Like someone waking up from a blackout they didn't know they'd entered. From outside the room, a hotel staff member knocked lightly on the door, having heard something. But there was no response. Inside, the air was still. And 2 lives had ended, one in blood, the other in silence. It was a housekeeper who found them. She was sent to restock the minibar after multiple service calls had gone unanswered. She knocked, waited, then used the master key. What she walked into sent her staggering backward into the hallway. Security was called. The resort manager arrived within minutes. Within the hour, local authorities had secured the suite, taped off the hallway, and moved guests to other parts of the property. Detective Rowan Mercer was assigned to lead the case. Known for his steady presence and sharp analysis, Mercer approached the crime scene with measured steps. He didn't react to the overturned furniture or the broken decor. His focus went straight to the details: blood patterns, distance between objects, the positioning of the body, the condition of the room's recording equipment. The footage retrieved from the resort system was immediately placed under lock. What began as a promotional idea, to capture candid moments of honeymoon joy, had instead chronicled a descent into violence. Mercer and his team reviewed every frame. The tension, the fight, the screams, and finally the silence. It wasn't a mystery. It was all right there. In the suite's closet, among Marina's belongings, police found a sealed envelope labeled MV. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, and a small photograph of Gideon Slate. The contents detailed conversations about future travel, possible relocation, and coded references to meeting places. Dorian was found seated on the floor, his back against the wall, blood on his hands, his eyes blank. He didn't resist. When the officers arrived, he looked up and spoke just 3 words. "I couldn't stop." It wasn't a confession full of regret. It wasn't defensive. It was quiet. Final. The case, from a legal standpoint, seemed open and shut. But what followed in the days after wasn't just about justice. It became something heavier. Forensic teams moved carefully through the suite, documenting every inch. The analysis revealed what the footage already suggested: a chaotic, violent confrontation that escalated with speed and intensity. Blood spatter across the far wall confirmed that Marina had attempted to resist. Defensive wounds on her arms supported it. The wineglass shattered near the balcony door was consistent with a thrown object, possibly in panic or self-defense. Traces of Marina's DNA were found beneath Dorian's fingernails. His were found on her neck, wrists, and blouse. There were no signs of premeditation. No weapon brought into the room, no notes, no materials suggesting a planned attack. It was raw, immediate. The emails between Marina and Gideon, particularly the escape plan and the alias used for the flight reservation, cast a long shadow over her intentions. But nothing could justify the outcome. Not to the law. Not to the people of Raven's Cove. The community's response was conflicted. Some viewed Dorian as a man pushed too far, wounded by betrayal, left with nothing but rage. Others saw a killer who had masked himself in decency and snapped when reality didn't match his expectations. Local forums filled with debates about guilt, accountability, and emotional limits. News outlets arrived quickly, and within days the resort had become the epicenter of national attention. Among those who had attended the wedding, grief was complicated. There was mourning for Marina, whose charm had once lit up every room she entered. But there was also a sense of disillusionment. About the kind of relationship she'd been hiding. About the things she chose not to say. Dorian's friends and colleagues were silent. Some issued carefully worded statements. Others withdrew completely. The version of him they had known was hard to reconcile with the man now awaiting trial. In the court of public opinion, neither party walked away innocent. One had died for her secret. The other would live with his. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Press lined the corridor outside. Locals filled the benches inside, faces tight with quiet disbelief. Some had known Dorian for years. None of them had imagined this would be the context in which they'd see him again. The prosecution framed the case simply. A man who discovered betrayal and acted with rage. Premeditation wasn't necessary, they argued. The outcome spoke for itself. Marina had been trying to end an affair. He had chosen to end her life. The defense countered by focusing on Dorian's mental state. They brought in psychologists, each one painting a portrait of a man deeply fractured, someone whose early trauma left him particularly vulnerable to rejection. They spoke about his father's abandonment, his tendency to suppress pain rather than confront it, and the emotional breakdown triggered by Marina's double life. They argued that the killing wasn't planned. It was the final rupture of a mind stretched too far. They didn't ask the jury to condone his actions, only to understand them. The recorded footage was shown once in a private session with the jury. It was not released to the public. Its emotional weight was too great, its violence too real. Those who saw it said it left no room for doubt. Dorian didn't deny anything. He gave a brief statement on the final day, looking directly at the judge, not the jury. "I failed her," he said, "and I failed myself. What I did can't be explained away by pain or betrayal. It happened. I own it." There was no dramatics. No plea for sympathy. He was sentenced to 25 years without parole. The courtroom was silent as the decision was read aloud. He didn't flinch. Outside, reporters scrambled for reactions. But those who mattered, Marina's family, Dorian's remaining friends, offered none. Too much had already been said. In the weeks following the trial, opinion pieces flooded national media. Some framed the case as a tragedy born of silence. Two people who never learned how to speak truthfully to one another. Others focused on the deeper issues it exposed: the fragility of trust, the consequences of repression, and the emotional cost of secrets. Mental health experts weighed in. One clinical psychologist described the event as a collision between suppressed trauma and immediate betrayal. She noted that Dorian's background, particularly the unresolved impact of his father's abandonment, made him emotionally brittle beneath the surface. Another expert emphasized how betrayal doesn't just hurt. It rewrites a person's internal logic, sometimes catastrophically. Gideon Slate was questioned shortly after the trial concluded. He didn't return to Raven's Cove. Authorities interviewed him remotely through international legal channels. His answers were cautious but direct. "Yes," he admitted. "We had plans." She said she couldn't take it anymore. She was thinking about leaving him. When asked if he encouraged her to follow through, he denied pressuring her. "She reached out to me," he said. "I didn't chase her. But I didn't stop her either." He acknowledged knowing about the honeymoon but claimed he didn't expect to hear from her during the trip. Gideon was never charged. His actions, while ethically questionable, did not meet the threshold for legal liability. But his involvement added one more layer of betrayal to the story. For Marina's family, it was a reminder that their daughter hadn't just made a mistake. She'd been living in conflict long before her death. Online discussion threads boiled with debate. Was Marina a manipulator or a woman trapped in emotional conflict? Was Dorian a monster or a broken man pushed too far? There were no easy answers. Only fragments of truth that refused to settle into a single version of the story. Detective Rowan Mercer didn't speak to the press often. But months after the case was closed, he agreed to one private interview with a legal ethics journal. When asked what stayed with him the most, he answered without hesitation. The violence was tragic, yes. But what struck me more was how long the silence had lasted between them. Two people sharing a life but hiding everything that mattered. Secrets aren't just lies, they're weights. And the cost of carrying them can sometimes be measured in blood. His words echoed in legal classrooms and relationship counseling forums alike. The case wasn't just about murder. It was about miscommunication, unspoken pain, and what happens when love turns into something people no longer recognize. Raven's Cove never quite returned to normal. The resort resumed operations, but its reputation never fully recovered. Couples still arrived, drawn by the location, but the staff moved with more caution. The suite where Marina died was eventually renovated and renamed, yet locals remembered. Quietly. Permanently. Each year on the anniversary of Marina's death, flowers appeared at the beach entrance near the cliffs. No card, no name. Just a silent offering. The story of Dorian and Marina became part of the town's unwritten history, passed from neighbor to neighbor, parent to child. It wasn't retold for shock. It was spoken as a warning, that love without honesty is fragile, and that betrayal rarely arrives without consequence. Psychologists still cite the case in workshops and university lectures. Not just because of the outcome, but because of what it exposed about emotional neglect, unhealed wounds, and what silence can mask. As for Dorian, his name faded slowly from headlines. He became another file in the justice system, marked by tragedy, defined by a moment. But the questions remained. What would you have done? Can love survive without truth? How many secrets can a person carry before something breaks? These aren't just questions for this story. They're questions for all of us. Because trust isn't a ceremony. It's a choice we make every day, until it's broken.